One minute I was watching a hole get dug for a swimming pool. The next, a stranger I'd never seen before was on my land, filming me like I was the final boss of a home improvement crime. She shouted that I was destroying community values and called the cops on the spot. Because apparently, building a pool in the middle of 15,000 acres of ranch land is now a felony in her book. I didn't know what was funnier, her outrage, or the fact that she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Ever had an HOA warrior charge into your life uninvited? Tell me what state you're watching from. Misplaced authority loves to travel. The morning had started so peacefully. I'd been standing next to my half-finished swimming pool, watching the excavator operator carefully shape the deep end while my horses grazed in the distance. The dry needle basins stretched out before me, 15,000 acres of Montana paradise that had belonged to the Lindell family for over a century. My great-grandfather had claimed this land back when Montana was still rough country, and we'd been the stewards of this entire valley ever since. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and I was thinking about how my kids would love splashing in this pool come summer. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive car engine struggling up my dirt road. A pristine white BMW pulled up, kicking dust all over its spotless paint job. Out stepped this woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom and somehow gotten lost in rural Montana. Her bob haircut was so perfectly styled it could have been carved from marble, and she was clutching her phone like it was some kind of weapon. Before I could even say hello, she marched right up to me with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. "Excuse me, you need to stop this construction immediately," she announced, holding up her phone and tapping the screen. I could see she was recording, probably documenting what she considered a crime in progress. "This swimming pool is a complete violation of our community standards." I set down my coffee mug and turned to face her properly, keeping my voice calm and friendly despite her aggressive tone. "Good morning to you too, ma'am. I'm Bo Lindell, and this is my ranch. I'm not sure what community you're referring to, but this construction is happening on private property that's been in my family for generations." She rolled her eyes dramatically, like I was some kind of idiot who didn't understand how the civilized world worked. "I'm Ramona Cly, president of the Dry Needle Hills Homeowners Association, and we have oversight authority for aesthetic compliance throughout this entire region." She waved her hand around like she was presenting the valley to an invisible audience. "Your little project here is destroying the natural beauty that our residents pay premium prices to enjoy." That's when I couldn't help but chuckle a little bit. Not because I was trying to be rude, but because the whole situation was starting to feel like a comedy sketch. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this ranch existed long before there was any HOA around here. My family has owned this land since 1923. I'm pretty sure we don't fall under your jurisdiction." But Ramona wasn't having any of it. She stepped closer to the excavation site, probably trying to get a better camera angle for her little documentary. "Jurisdiction is exactly what we're talking about here. The HOA has clear authority to maintain standards throughout the valley, and this monstrosity is completely unacceptable." She gestured wildly at my pool construction, which honestly looked pretty normal to me, just a rectangular hole in the ground that would soon be filled with water and happy family memories. As she got more animated in her speech, Ramona stepped backwards to get what she probably thought would be a dramatic wide shot of the destruction I was causing. What she didn't notice was that she was backing up toward the excavator, which was still running and had just scooped up a bucket full of muddy earth. The operator, bless his heart, was trying to wave her away, but she was too focused on her performance to pay attention. "This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that ruins property values for everyone," she declared, just as the excavator swung around and dumped its load. A spray of mud and dirt flew through the air, catching her perfectly and turning her from corporate executive to abstract art project in about 2 seconds flat. The look on her face was absolutely priceless. For a moment, she just stood there in shock, mud dripping from her hair and her outfit now more brown than pink. I could see her phone screen was splattered with dirt, and whatever audience she'd been performing for probably got quite a show. You did that on purpose," she sputtered, trying to wipe mud from her face with the back of her hand. I held up my hands innocently. "Ma'am, nobody forced you to walk behind heavy machinery. That's just basic job site safety." The excavator operator was trying hard not to laugh, and I have to admit I was fighting back a smile myself. There's something poetic about watching someone get a face full of reality when they're trying to control things that aren't theirs to control. Ramona's face went from shock to pure rage faster than a Montana weather change. She pointed a muddy finger at me and declared, "This isn't over. I'm calling the authorities, and they're going to shut down this whole operation." She stomped back toward her BMW, leaving muddy footprints in the dirt and muttering something about permits and violations. As she reached her car, she turned back one more time and shouted, "There will be police officers here to arrest you." I just waved goodbye and called back, "I'll be right here waiting for them, ma'am. Have a wonderful day." As her BMW disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, I couldn't help but wonder just how far this woman was willing to take things. Little did she know, she was about to find out exactly who she was messing with. 2 hours later, my peace was interrupted by what would become the most ironic phone call in law enforcement history. While I was inside grabbing another cup of coffee, Ramona was apparently on the phone with 911, her voice dripping with outrage as she reported what she considered a serious crime in progress. "I need police officers here immediately. There's a man conducting unauthorized construction that's violating multiple building codes and threatening community safety." The dispatcher, professional as always, assured her that an officer would be sent to investigate the complaint. What Ramona didn't know was that the officer assigned to respond was my own deputy, Gideon Tate, who'd been working under my supervision for the past 4 years. When Gideon saw the address on his dispatch screen, he immediately recognized it as his boss's ranch. I can only imagine the confused look on his face as he read through the complaint details. Unauthorized construction, building violations, threats to community safety, all supposedly happening at the home of the county sheriff. He called me up before heading over, and I could hear him trying not to laugh as he explained the situation. "Boss, I've got a complaint about you. Some lady says you're running an illegal construction operation." I made a quick decision that would prove to be quite entertaining. "Don't tell her who I am, Gideon. I want to see exactly how far she's willing to push this thing. Just play along and do your job professionally." Sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable people is to give them exactly what they're asking for. About 20 minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of our patrol car coming up the drive. Gideon climbed out, wearing his full uniform, trying his best to look serious and official despite the absurdity of the situation. "Afternoon, sir," he said, loud enough for anyone listening to hear. "I've received a complaint about construction activities on this property. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I played my part perfectly, adopting the slightly nervous tone of a concerned citizen who definitely didn't want any trouble with the law. "Of course, officer. I certainly don't want any problems. Is there some kind of issue with my pool construction?" Behind his professional demeanor, I could see Gideon struggling not to crack a smile. That's when Ramona made her grand reappearance. She'd apparently gone home to clean up and change clothes because she was now wearing a different outfit. She had upgraded her recording equipment too, bringing what looked like professional camera gear. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she announced, marching toward us with renewed confidence. "This man has been completely uncooperative and hostile. He's conducting illegal construction activities and threatening the safety and property values of our entire community." Gideon nodded seriously and pulled out his notepad, playing the role of the dutiful law enforcement officer investigating a serious complaint. "Ma'am, I'll need to examine the evidence and speak with both parties before making any determinations. Sir, do you have permits for this construction project?" I nodded and pulled out my folder of paperwork, which was completely legitimate and up to date. "Yes, officer, everything should be in order. I obtained all the necessary permits from the county before beginning work." In her excitement to capture the perfect shot of justice being served, Ramona started backing up again to get a wider angle of the confrontation. You'd think she would have learned her lesson from the mud incident earlier, but apparently not. As she stepped backwards while narrating her video, she failed to notice the large pile of horse manure that my animals had left behind during their morning graze. "This is exactly why we need strong community standards," she was saying, just as her shoes found their target. Down she went, landing right in it. Her video turned from crusade to catastrophe. Gideon had to turn away to compose himself, pretending to cough while actually trying not to burst out laughing. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, offering her a hand up with the most professional tone he could manage. After reviewing all my paperwork and finding everything completely legal and properly permitted, Gideon delivered his official verdict. "Sir, all your documentation appears to be in order. The construction is taking place on private property with proper permits, and I don't see any violations of county regulations." Ramona's jaw dropped open in disbelief, as if the very concept of legal construction was foreign to her. "That's impossible. There have to be violations. What about community standards? What about environmental impact?" Gideon shook his head politely. Ma'am, those would be civil matters between private parties, not criminal violations that require police intervention. But Ramona wasn't ready to give up. With horse manure still clinging to her clothes and her online audience probably numbering in the hundreds by now, she pulled out what she thought was her ace in the hole. Fine, if you won't handle this properly, I demand to speak with the sheriff. I want the highest authority in this county to see what's happening here. That's when I couldn't resist a little smile. The woman was so determined to escalate this situation that she was literally demanding to speak to herself. Ma'am, I'd be very interested to meet this sheriff myself. I'm sure he'd have some fascinating insights into this situation. Gideon was biting his lips so hard I was worried he might draw blood. I can certainly arrange for you to speak with the sheriff, ma'am. In fact, I'll make sure he comes out here personally to address your concern. The next morning brought a whole new level of drama to my peaceful valley. Ramona had apparently spent the entire night plotting her next move because, by sunrise, she was already busy creating what she called an online community action group. Her video from the previous day, featuring her spectacular fall into horse manure, had somehow gained over 1,200 views overnight, though I suspect most people were watching for the entertainment value rather than supporting her cause. But you have to admire her persistence. Not many people would double down after becoming an accidental internet meme, but Ramona was apparently made of sterner stuff than your average HOA president. Her first move was to create an online petition titled "Stop Pool Vandalism in Dry Needle Basin," complete with dramatic photos of my construction site that she'd apparently taken with a telephoto lens from the road. The petition claimed that my pool was an environmental disaster and a threat to community values that needed to be stopped immediately. She printed out 200 copies and began going door to door throughout the HOA subdivision, armed with her clipboard and an intensity that probably scared most of her neighbors. Her approach was less friendly neighbor seeking support and more door-to-door salesperson who won't take no for an answer. The response from the community was mixed, to put it diplomatically. Most signed just to make her leave. Others closed doors without a word. But there were also quite a few people who knew my family's history in the valley and weren't about to sign anything against the Lindells. One encounter in particular caught my attention. I watched from my truck as Ramona knocked on the door of a small house where 82-year-old Miss Patterson lived. When the door opened, Ramona launched into her prepared speech about community standards and property values. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't having any of it. "Young lady," Mrs. Patterson said in a voice that carried across the yard, "the Lindell family has been good to this community since before you were born. If Bo wants to build a pool on his own land, that's his business." But here's where things got interesting. Ramona's reaction wasn't just predictably dramatic, it was revealing. "But ma'am, you don't understand the long-term damage this construction could cause to our property values and community aesthetic." Mrs. Patterson just smiled and shook her head again. "Honey, that family owns this entire valley. They've been taking care of this land since the 1920s. I think they know what they're doing." That's when I saw something click in Ramona's expression. A moment of confusion and perhaps the first hint that she might not understand the situation as well as she thought she did. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "What do you mean, they own the entire valley?" she asked. But Mrs. Patterson had already begun closing her door with the finality of someone who'd said their piece. As soon as she got home, Ramona apparently went straight to her computer to research the Lindell family and our connection to Dry Needle Basin. I can only imagine what she found. Old newspaper articles about my great-grandfather's homestead claim, records of land purchases and acquisitions over the decades, and probably some mention of our family's long history of community involvement. What she probably didn't find, however, was any recent information about my current role as county sheriff, since I tend to keep a low profile and prefer my ranch clothes to my uniform whenever possible. But for the first time, I could see doubt creeping into her confident demeanor. Later that week, Ramona set up a petition booth at the local farmers market. The farmers market crowd wasn't exactly receptive to her message. Most of the people shopping there were locals who knew my family, and many of them had grown up swimming in our pond or attending community events at our ranch. When kids started recognizing me and running over to say hello, calling me Uncle Bo, the way kids in small communities do, Ramona began to realize that she might have misjudged the local dynamics. "Do you know Uncle Bo?" one little girl asked her innocently. "He lets us pet his horses sometimes." Ramona's forced smile was painful to watch as she tried to maintain her community activist facade while surrounded by people who clearly saw me as a beloved neighbor rather than a criminal. That's when Mother Nature decided to add her own commentary to Ramona's campaign. A sudden gust of wind caught her petition papers and sent them flying across the market area like confetti. Ramona chased after them frantically, trying to gather her scattered documents while her pop-up tent collapsed behind her. Children joined the paper chase, laughing while her tent collapsed behind her. By the time she gathered everything up, her professional presentation had turned into a muddy, crumpled mess. Standing there in the aftermath of her petition disaster, surrounded by muddy papers and a collapsed tent, I could see Ramona starting to question whether she'd chosen the right hill to die on. Ramona spent the next several days transforming herself into what she apparently believed was a legal expert. Armed with free internet research and a dangerous amount of confidence, she printed out over 40 pages of building codes, zoning regulations, and construction guidelines that she'd found online. The problem was, most of what she'd discovered applied to commercial buildings, high-density residential developments, or properties in incorporated city limits, none of which had anything to do with my rural ranch construction. But details like jurisdiction and applicability weren't going to stop someone as determined as Ramona to prove she was right. Her research had convinced her that she'd found the smoking gun that would shut down my pool construction once and for all. She spent hours crafting what she believed was a professional cease and desist letter, complete with legal terminology copied and pasted from various websites, in a tone that suggested she had the full weight of the law behind her. The document was an impressive example of someone who had just enough knowledge to be dangerous, filled with threatening language about violations and consequences while completely missing the fundamental issue of whether any of it actually applied to my situation. I have to admit, watching someone work so hard to be wrong was almost admirable in its own way. When she returned to my ranch for round 2 of our confrontation, she came prepared for battle. Her car was loaded with file folders, printed documents, and a tablet computer for recording what she was convinced would be my inevitable surrender to her superior legal knowledge. I was out by the horse pasture, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching my animals graze in the morning sun, when I heard her BMW struggling up the dirt road once again. But this time, something was different. Instead of her usual aggressive confidence, I could sense an undercurrent of desperation. The woman was starting to realize that her usual tactics weren't working, and desperate people do unpredictable things. "I've done my research," she announced, before she'd even reached me, waving a thick folder in the air like it was some kind of weapon. "You're in violation of building codes, and I have the documentation to prove it." I set down the water bucket I'd been carrying and turned to face her with genuine curiosity. For a moment, I found myself actually feeling sorry for her. Here was someone who'd clearly spent days working on something that was fundamentally flawed from the start. "That sounds serious. Where exactly did you find all this information?" She smiled triumphantly and pulled out her stack of papers, clearly proud of the hours she'd spent putting together what she believed was an airtight case against me. Ramona launched into a detailed presentation of her findings, reading directly from printouts and citing code numbers with the confidence of someone who'd never actually studied law, but had spent a weekend on legal websites. "According to the International Building Code, swimming pools require setback approvals." I listened politely as she rattled off more regulations. She quoted city codes to a man building a pool on county ranch land. When she finally finished her presentation, I asked to see her documentation. The papers she handed me were indeed impressive in their volume, but it took only a few minutes of reading to see the fundamental problem with her research. "Ma'am, I appreciate all the work you've put into this, but these regulations apply to commercial developments and properties within city limits. This is a private ranch in unincorporated county land." She stared at me blankly for a moment, as if the concept of different jurisdictions having different rules had never occurred to her. "Laws are laws," she declared, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "You can't just ignore building codes because you live in the country." That's when I decided to ask the question that had been bothering me since our first encounter, and I could see it was starting to bother her too. "Ramona, I'm curious about something. What exactly gives the HOA authority to regulate construction on properties outside the subdivision boundaries?" She blinked a few times, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to come up with an answer that didn't exist. "The HOA has clear oversight authority for maintaining community standards throughout the entire region," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. It was the first time I'd heard her sound uncertain, and I realized that somewhere deep down, she was starting to understand that she might be wrong. As we were having this conversation, my horse Thunderbolt had wandered over to investigate the commotion. Horses are curious animals, and he was particularly interested in the stack of papers Ramona was holding. Before either of us could react, he'd grabbed the corner of her folder with his teeth and started chewing on what represented hours of her research. "No, stop that!" Ramona shrieked, trying to pull her documents away from a 1,000-pound animal who thought he'd found an interesting snack. Papers scattered across the ground, some of them torn and others bearing impressive teeth marks from Thunderbolt's investigation. Standing up, with dirt on her knees and half her documents destroyed, she pulled out what she clearly thought was her trump card. "Fine, if you won't listen to reason, I'm calling the sheriff's office directly. I'll have them send someone out here who understands the law." I couldn't help but smile at that threat. The woman was so determined to escalate this situation that she was literally threatening me with myself. "That sounds like an excellent idea, Ramona. I've been wanting to have a conversation with the sheriff about this situation myself." Her confidence returned immediately, like someone who just remembered they had an ace up their sleeve. "Good, because once the sheriff sees what you're doing here, this whole operation is going to be shut down permanently." The next morning started with a phone call that would change everything. While I was having my usual coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Ramona was apparently working herself into a state of righteous indignation as she dialed the sheriff's office. Her voice, when she finally connected with our dispatcher, was dripping with urgency and moral authority. "This is an emergency situation. I need the sheriff to respond immediately to a serious violation of building codes and community safety regulations." Our dispatcher, trained to handle all kinds of calls, from reasonable requests to complete nonsense, professionally assured her that the sheriff would personally respond to her complaint within 30 minutes. What Ramona didn't realize was that she'd just set in motion the most ironic law enforcement response in the history of Dry Needle County. When the call came through to me, I couldn't help but laugh at the beautiful symmetry of the situation. Here was a woman who'd spent days threatening to call the sheriff, demanding sheriff intervention, and insisting that the sheriff would surely see things her way. And now she was finally going to get exactly what she'd been asking for. I decided it was time to end this charade once and for all. So I went to my closet and pulled out my full sheriff's uniform for the first time since this whole situation began. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to give people exactly what they think they want. The drive to my own ranch felt surreal. Here I was, responding to a complaint about myself, wearing my official badge and driving the county patrol vehicle to investigate my own alleged crimes. Gideon had offered to come along for moral support, but I told him this was something I needed to handle personally. As I drove up the familiar dirt road, I could see that Ramona had prepared for this moment like it was the most important day of her life. She'd set up multiple camera positions around the construction site, probably planning to document her vindication for her online followers, who were about to witness the greatest comeback in HOA history. When I arrived at the scene, I could see that Ramona had invited several neighbors to witness what she clearly expected to be my arrest and the shutdown of my pool construction. There were about a dozen people standing around, including some folks from the HOA who'd probably been promised a show. Ramona herself was wearing what looked like her most professional outfit, and she had a folder of fresh documents to replace the ones Thunderbolt had destroyed. She was practically bouncing with excitement as she saw the official sheriff's vehicle approach, probably already composing her victory speech in her head. The moment I stepped out of that patrol car in full uniform was absolutely priceless. The collective gasp from the assembled crowd was audible from 50 feet away, but nothing compared to the look on Ramona's face. Her expression went from confident anticipation to complete shock to something that might have been understanding, all in the space of about 3 seconds. Her camera, which had been carefully positioned to capture the sheriff arresting the troublemaker, instead recorded her jaw dropping open and the folder of documents slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. It was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in real time. "Good afternoon, folks," I said in my most professional law enforcement voice, touching the brim of my hat politely. "I'm Sheriff Lindell. I understand someone here needs to speak with me about a law enforcement matter." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Ramona was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost, her mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. The neighbors who'd come to watch the show were looking back and forth between us, slowly beginning to understand that they were witnessing something much more interesting than they'd expected. You could practically see the mental gears turning as people tried to process what they were seeing. It took Ramona almost a full minute to find her voice again, and when she did, it came out as a barely audible whisper. But you can't be." I nodded helpfully. I'm Sheriff Bo Lindell, ma'am. I've held this position for the past 8 years, and before that, I was a deputy for 6 years, under the previous sheriff. Now, I understand you have some concerns about law enforcement matters that you'd like to discuss. Behind me, I could hear some of the neighbors beginning to whisper among themselves as the reality of the situation sank in. Someone in the crowd actually started laughing, though they tried to cover it with a cough. "This is impossible," Ramona finally managed to say, her voice rising with each word. "You can't investigate yourself. This is a conflict of interest. You're supposed to be impartial." I pulled out my notepad, just like any professional law enforcement officer responding to a complaint. "Ma'am, let's start with the basics. What exactly would you like to report? What crime do you believe has been committed?" The question seemed to short-circuit her brain for a moment, because she just stood there blinking at me like she was trying to reboot her entire understanding of reality. It's not often you get to watch someone realize that they've been demanding to speak to the manager while yelling at the manager. One of the neighbors, an older gentleman who'd apparently figured out what was happening, started chuckling quietly. Then another person joined in, and within a few seconds, half the crowd was struggling not to laugh out loud at the absurdity of the situation. Ramona's carefully planned moment of triumph had turned into a public embarrassment of epic proportions, and her online recording was capturing every second of it for posterity. This isn't how this was supposed to go," she stammered, looking around at the amused faces of her audience, like she expected someone to explain how the universe had suddenly stopped making sense. "Ma'am," I said gently, "I'm here to investigate your complaint about building code violations and community safety issues. Could you please explain to me what specific crimes you believe have been committed on this property?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, because we both knew that there were no crimes, no violations, and no legal standing for any of her demands. Ramona looked down at her scattered documents, then back up at my badge, then over at the crowd of neighbors who were no longer taking her seriously at all. For the first time since I'd met her, Ramona Cly was completely and utterly speechless. Sometimes the best comebacks are the ones where you don't have to say anything at all. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Ramona finally found her voice again, though it came out shaky and desperate. This is a clear conflict of interest. You can't investigate yourself. There have to be laws against this." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her point seriously. "Ma'am, you're absolutely right that I can't investigate myself. But first you'd need to tell me what exactly I'm supposed to have done wrong. What specific law have I broken?" The question seemed to stump her completely, because she just stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. It's remarkable how quickly someone's entire argument can fall apart when you ask them to be specific about their complaints. "Building violations," she finally blurted out. "Unauthorized construction, environmental damage, community standards violations." I pulled out my folder of permits and documentation, the same papers that Gideon had already reviewed and approved. "Could you point out which specific building code I violated? These are all the permits and approvals required for swimming pool construction on private property in unincorporated county land." As I spread the documents out on the hood of my patrol car, several neighbors moved closer to get a better look, their curiosity apparently overcoming their amusement at Ramona's predicament. That's when I decided it was time to provide some education about local property rights and jurisdictions, not just for Ramona's benefit, but for everyone who'd gathered to watch the spectacle. "Folks, since we're all here, let me clarify something that seems to be causing confusion. This ranch sits on private property that's been owned by my family since 1923. It's located entirely outside the boundaries of any homeowners association or municipal jurisdiction. I pulled out a county survey map and spread it across the car hood next to my permits. The HOA subdivision boundaries end approximately half a mile down the road. They have no authority over construction or activities on this ranch. The crowd gathered closer to examine the map, and I could see understanding dawning on several faces. One neighbor, a woman who lived near the edge of the HOA subdivision, spoke up. "Wait, so the HOA can't actually regulate anything outside their own development?" I shook my head. "That's correct. Homeowners associations only have authority over properties that are specifically included in their boundaries and whose owners have agreed to abide by their rules through purchase contracts or membership agreements." The concept seemed revolutionary to some people, as if they'd never considered that HOA rules might have actual limits. Ramona was frantically flipping through her folder of research, probably trying to find something that would support her position, but coming up empty. But what about community standards? What about property values? What about environmental impact, she demanded, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each question. I gestured toward the vast expanse of the valley around us. Ma'am, my family has been stewards of this land for over a century. We've maintained it, protected it, and shared it with the community through countless events, emergency assistance, and neighborly cooperation. I think our track record speaks for itself. That's when one of the neighbors dropped a bombshell that even I hadn't expected someone to bring up so directly. Ramona, didn't you know that several houses in our subdivision are actually built on land that's leased from the Lindell family? An uncomfortable murmur went through the crowd as people began to realize that their understanding of property ownership in the area might not be as clear as they'd thought. Ramona's face went white as she processed this information. That's impossible. We own our properties outright. The poor woman was discovering that reality had quite a few more layers than she'd realized. I nodded confirmation of what the neighbor had said. Actually, that's partially correct. When the subdivision was developed 15 years ago, my father leased several parcels to the developer because the original property boundaries included some areas that were perfect for residential development. The homeowners owned their houses and immediate lots, but the underlying land rights for about a third of the subdivision remain with the Lindell family. The implications of this revelation were clearly sinking in for several people in the crowd, and Ramona looked like she might be sick. Nothing quite prepares you for discovering that you've been trying to boss around your own landlord. So let me get this straight, said another neighbor, a man whose house was apparently on one of the leased parcels. You're saying that Ramona has been trying to tell the actual landowner what he can and can't do with his property? The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone, except Ramona herself, who was still desperately trying to find some angle that would salvage her position. There have to be regulations. There have to be oversight committees. You can't just do whatever you want. But her voice was getting smaller and smaller, like someone who was beginning to realize they'd picked a fight with the wrong person. The crowd was no longer on her side. People were shaking their heads, and I could hear murmurs of dissatisfaction with how they'd been misled. Ramona's online recording, which had been meant to document her victory over a neighborhood bully, was instead broadcasting her complete humiliation to anyone unfortunate enough to be watching. There's something almost tragic about watching someone's moment of triumph turn into their greatest defeat, especially when it's entirely self-inflicted. In a last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, Ramona pulled out her phone and announced, "I'm calling the state police. I'm reporting corruption and abuse of power." Several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud at this point, and I had to maintain my professional composure while privately enjoying the spectacle. "Ma'am, you're certainly welcome to contact any law enforcement agency you'd like. However, I should point out that no crimes have been committed here, no laws have been broken, and no abuse of power has occurred. I'm simply building a swimming pool on my own property with proper permits." Sometimes the best defense is just stating the obvious facts. The final blow came when one of the HOA board members who'd come to watch the show spoke up. "Ramona, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your leadership and whether you've been representing the facts accurately to the homeowners." Other residents began nodding in agreement, and I could see that Ramona's reign as HOA president was effectively over. Standing there in front of a crowd of neighbors who no longer supported her, with her online recording broadcasting her defeat to the world, Ramona Cly finally realized that she'd lost more than just a battle about a swimming pool. She'd lost her credibility, her position, and her standing in the community she'd tried so hard to control. The aftermath of Ramona's very public meltdown was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president, citing her misrepresentation of facts and abuse of her position to pursue personal vendettas. The vote wasn't even close. It was 7-0, with Ramona herself being the only board member not present, having apparently locked herself in her house to avoid the embarrassment of facing her former constituents. A friendly woman named Mrs. Kim was elected as interim president, with a mandate to rebuild relationships with the broader community and establish clear, reasonable guidelines for HOA activities that actually made sense. In one final act of desperation, Ramona did indeed call the state police to report what she claimed was corruption and abuse of power by the local sheriff's department. The state trooper who returned her call was professional but firm in explaining that local sheriffs have complete jurisdiction over matters in their counties, and that building a swimming pool with proper permits on private property doesn't constitute abuse of power by any definition of the term. When she tried to escalate further up the chain of command, she was politely told that the matter was closed and advised to consider resolving any remaining disputes through civil channels. Sometimes when you dig a hole, the best thing to do is stop digging. The community response was exactly what you'd expect from small-town folks who'd watched their neighbor make a fool of herself on a public stage. There was definitely some embarrassment about the whole situation, but also a sense of relief that the drama was finally over. Several residents approached me over the next few days to apologize for signing Ramona's petition, explaining that they'd felt pressured and hadn't understood the full situation. I assured them there were no hard feelings. Small communities sometimes get caught up in misunderstandings, and the important thing was that everything was resolved peacefully. Besides, I'd gotten more entertainment out of this situation than I'd had in years. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Kim called me with an unexpected proposal. Sheriff Lindell, the HOA board, was wondering if you'd be open to hosting a community barbecue once your pool construction is finished. We think it would be a great way to bring everyone together and show that there are no hard feelings about this whole mess. I thought it was a wonderful idea, and we started planning what would become the biggest community gathering Dry Needle Basin had seen in years. Nothing brings people together quite like good food and the opportunity to laugh about shared absurdity. Word about the barbecue spread quickly through both the HOA subdivision and the broader Valley community. People were excited about the chance to see the infamous swimming pool that had caused so much drama, and everyone wanted to meet their neighbors in a more positive setting. Local businesses donated food and supplies, and several folks volunteered to help with setup and cooking. It was shaping up to be exactly the kind of community event that brings people together rather than driving them apart. Sometimes the best way to heal division is to throw a really good party. The pool construction was completed about 2 weeks later, and I have to say it turned out even better than I'd hoped. The water was crystal clear, the landscaping around it was beautiful, and the view of the valley from the pool deck was absolutely spectacular. My kids were thrilled, and my wife was already planning all the family gatherings and summer parties we'd host around our new centerpiece. But first, we had a community barbecue to celebrate with our neighbors and to officially close the book on the Great Pool War of Dry Needle Basin. The day of the barbecue was perfect. Sunny skies, comfortable temperature, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine trees and barbecue smoke across the valley. People started arriving around noon, bringing side dishes and lawn chairs. The atmosphere was friendly and relaxed, with neighbors who'd never really talked before finding common ground and shared interests. Kids ran around, playing games, while adults shared stories and enjoyed cold drinks in the Montana sunshine. It was exactly the kind of day that reminds you why small communities can be so special when people actually try to get along. Gideon showed up in his off-duty clothes, and I took the opportunity to make an announcement that had been a long time coming. Folks, I want to take a minute to recognize Deputy Gideon Tate, who's been doing outstanding work for our county for the past 4 years. I'm pleased to announce that he's being promoted to senior deputy. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and it felt good to celebrate something positive after all the negativity we dealt with. As the afternoon wore on, someone inevitably brought up the topic that was on everyone's mind. "Whatever happened to Ramona?" asked one of the HOA residents. Mrs. Kim answered diplomatically, "She's decided to relocate to a community that might be a better fit for her lifestyle preferences. Her house went on the market last week." The general consensus seemed to be that this was probably the best outcome for everyone involved, including Ramona herself. The highlight of the day came when we officially christened the pool. About a dozen children immediately cannonballed into the pool simultaneously, creating an enormous splash that soaked half the adults standing nearby. Everyone burst out laughing, and within minutes the pool was full of kids having the time of their lives. It was exactly the kind of scene I'd imagined when I first decided to build this pool. As the sun began to set and people started packing up their things, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. What had started as a simple home improvement project had somehow turned into a community-wide drama, then resolved into something even better, a stronger, more connected neighborhood where people actually knew and cared about each other. Sometimes the best outcomes come from the most unexpected challenges, and sometimes you have to go through a little chaos to find your way to peace. 3 months later, I was sitting by my pool with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, when Gideon's patrol car came up the drive. "Morning, boss," he called out as he walked over. "Got a new complaint for you." I sighed and set down my coffee cup, wondering what fresh drama had found its way to my peaceful valley. Please tell me it's not another HOA situation. Gideon grinned and shook his head. Nope, this one's different. Mrs. Patterson called to complain that you're swimming too quietly in the mornings. She says her grandkids like to listen to the splashing sounds when they're visiting, and you're not making enough noise for their entertainment. I started laughing and stood up from my chair. Well, we can't have disappointed grandchildren, can we? And with that, I took a running leap and cannonballed into my pool with the biggest splash I could manage. Sometimes being sheriff means serving the community in ways you never expected, but I have to say, this was definitely the most enjoyable complaint I'd ever received.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of